Hello, booze and ghouls. I bid you welcome to this year's Cookie Pocket Halloween special, the 2024. I think this is the fourth or fifth one that we've done. Maybe fourth. That sounds right. I should have checked this. We're recording this quite late at night and quite early in October.
It's not that late.
Not for Mitchell.
It feels
it's late
pretty
for the
late.
two of us, but not for Mitchell.
Yeah. Certainly not the latest we've recorded one of these. We've gone
That's
later.
True.
But you don't need to know all that behind the scenes stuff, dear listeners. It's the spooky season, and it's time to watch spooky movies and carve jack-o'-lanterns and maybe hang up decorations. Doesn't quite feel like that yet because it's only like October 6th. But how's the season been going for you guys?
Oh, pretty good. I've already got my short list of horror movies. I like to sort of focus on that genre in October. I started that last year and it was fun, but it also had an effect on my psyche. So we'll see how it goes this year.
You've been off the chain. You watched like 3 back-to-back horror movies on October 1st, right?
Yeah. I started strong.
Extra spooky. Extra spooky. Is Halloween a Christian holiday? That's a good question.
I don't think so. I think it's based in pagan ritual.
I feel like it's religiously inspired somehow. Anyway,
Maybe,
I
yeah.
saw 4K Sleepy Hollow for the first time. I've seen Sleepy Hollow a bazillion times, at least a bazillion, probably a couple more than that. And this is like the first time seeing it in 4K, and it definitely is like a completely different movie.
Oh.
I got my dad for his birthday on the 3rd, 4K player, and definitely
nice.
like showing your parents 4K is like even crazier, especially when they're like DVD is like a crazy thing not that long ago. And I just think, it was one of the really good Tim Burton 4K discs for sure.
Might have to try it.
Yeah, that's about it. I haven't gotten into it yet. I'm usually a last minute feeler. I'm in a completely different state, and I usually don't watch a lot of films on my own, which sounds kind of crazy. So, but I have a lot of normal films on the docket. We'll probably may or may not end up bringing up. But if you don't, just follow me on Letterboxd.
It's true.
You'll see it there, or X, or wherever you want to look at it.
You can follow us all on Letterboxd at the links in the description on YouTube, by the way.
How about that?
Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow actually is host to one of my favorite Cookie Pocket memories, where we were like 3 movies deep into a Halloween marathon or something and decided to turn on the descriptive audio at the beginning of Sleepy Hollow just for a laugh. And so the whole opening scene, our audio experience was, the man rides through the cornfield in a carriage. There is a pumpkin. It was a good laugh. But we aren't talking about any of those films today. We're talking about a fairly unknown pick from me. I had not seen this film. I knew very little about it, actually, other than the poster and that some other people with kind of bizarre film preferences who I admire and whose opinions I respect had recommended it as like a Halloween watch. Because today we are talking about Avery Crounse's Eyes of Fire, also known as Crying Blue Sky, depending upon the cut that you watched. The story is pretty familiar for folk horror, at least the basic setup. It's about an adulterous preacher who, with his followers and his lover, they're all kicked out of their Puritan settlement on the American frontier, and I think the year is like 1750. And they have to wander through the wilderness until they find a valley. And they decide, this is perfect. This is a perfect place for us. This is where we should live. This is the promised land. God has given this land to us. Only to discover that things are darker than they may appear. And that, as the tagline says, which I think is a really good tagline, the secret is sleeping in the trees. Now, eagle-eared listeners or bat-eared listeners, I suppose, may realize that the basic setup there is pretty much just The Witch, Robert Eggers' film, which, depending upon how you feel on the movie, might be a better execution of the concept. Before we go too deep into that, what did you guys think of Eyes of Fire or Crying Blue Sky, depending upon the cut that you watched?
Well, I watched Eyes of Fire, the shorter cut, because it was the only one available to me. I had planned on getting this from the library, but it didn't come in time, so I had to stream it. And I don't think you can stream the longer cut. But I had a mixed experience with this. I landed on a 2.5, and I had great difficulty following the events and the characters and just everything. It felt like it felt like I was back in season 1 of Cookie Pocket, because it definitely felt like the kind of movie I would be very hard on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I try not to especially when I'm watching a movie for the podcast, I try not to do anything except watch it. Or if I come up with a rundown that I'm worried I'll forget, I'll quickly type the rundown in a note. But and I did that, as I always do. But after the movie was over, I did spend some time on reading summaries to orient myself and also to prepare myself for the conversation. I still couldn't really name characters, and I think events were confusing to me, especially in the first 20 minutes. It's kind of a breakneck pace, at least in the theatrical shorter cut. When all of the characters are still at the settlement, you can gather that somebody is accused of adultery, but then very quickly he's being hung, and then what's her face like breaks the noose, and then
Leah.
Yes,
Leah, yeah.
And then I don't remember even if that's like they run away at that point, or if like I don't know if like breaking the noose just means that the death penalty no longer needs to be enforced.
They if it's the same between cuts, I think his followers break in and then they lock them in the barn and steal all their stuff.
Okay,
yeah,
it's coming back to me. I watched this only a day ago, I think.
Yeah.
So it's not even like I'm coming at this from a big distance, but I think once we sort of leave the settlement, it becomes a bit more digestible or understandable. I think the character moments that more or less make sense to me are when he sort of rescues this orphaned Native American child, and then there's this tension between the other kids and Leah again. I think that plays okay, but other than that, I really couldn't get on board with the characters here, and I felt like the quality of the scares really only come in the last 20 minutes or so for me. So I think I gave The Witch maybe a 3.5 or maybe a 4, so it's not too much of a scoring difference, but I definitely strongly prefer The Witch to this, and I think a big part of it is just having a much smaller cast in The Witch. But some interesting ideas, and as you mentioned in your review, Zach, I think the visuals are pretty strong, but not too much to latch onto for me.
I have facial hair to stroke now. How about that? That's not going to be
my
around.
5 o'clock shadow.
That's the scariest thing of
30%.
all in this Cookie Pocket Halloween special.
He needs a razor. So, I love The Witch. I'm sorry, I thought we were talking about The Witch today. But The Witch is.
I think we could definitely bring it up because there are a lot of similarities.
Like said,
I think
it's like the general plot is like a 1-to-1 comparison, basically. For this film, I was very surprised at how immersive it was. And Zach, you mentioned in your review the lighting was definitely a skill. That was like probably one of the best like production qualities of the entire thing, was how well the lighting was used. Even at nighttime, like it's something that's very hard to pull off. I feel like, especially if you're going further back in time like this, there's not really a lot of like standalone vistas outside of nature. So you pretty much have to manipulate nature, especially if you're using like the American frontier, where there isn't a lot going on. There isn't a lot particularly interesting, and it can get very repetitive having the same sunrise and sunset backdrop with the same forests and rolling hills over and over again. So I really appreciated that. I felt very convinced that it was of the period, which The Witch also does very well in the Puritan times. But I think generally this film is relying too much on the character dynamics and relying way too much on the interpersonal conflicts. And I feel like that there might have been an intention to have these set up prior to, so that once the actual spiritual, supernatural evil things start happening to them, it's more justifiable. It makes a lot more sense. It's more convincing to have like these already established characters, so that they're not just suddenly fighting with each other, or they're not just suddenly having all these relationship issues with each other. And I think the only real setup that works for me in that respect is Will and the two women. I think that whole adultery angle thing definitely is the most prevalent plot point throughout the entire film, and I feel like that was relatively effectual. Like it definitely made a lot of sense. A lot of the disdain for Will and disdain for his constant pushing religion down everybody's throats the whole time. Uh, Other than that, I didn't really care about any of the characters at all. Like there was really nothing to hold on to the whole time. I think Leah was super compelling, and there's a lot of really interesting standalone scenes with her that felt like it was supposed to be hinting towards something greater, but then it ends up just not at all. It's like, oh, it's just because it's bizarre and it's interesting to look at, or it's just a part of the vibe, man. It's super creepy, and it doesn't really serve as any setup. Like the motivations for Leah are not clear to me very much at all, honestly. I think they were supposed to be the most clear at the end, and still it didn't really make a whole lot of sense. I think the motivations of the spirit people were perfect, because Marion's out at the campfire like, yeah, all these animals I'm eating, they're all going to come together and take revenge on us or something. And then he continually eats the rabbit. So it's like, well, we know where that's going to go, where that's going. That ends up being like the main antagonist with the girl and everything. But other than that, like there's too much focus on all the humans. There's too much build up for a whole lot of nothing. And it ends up being like you said, Zach, in your review, like a muted climax where it's like just this one thing happening and too little too late, like Christian said. It's like there's just so much that could have been used early on that could have been eerie and creepy to look at, even in like the first 10 minutes. That just doesn't show up. It's just very weird. Like you're confused as to what movie it is until like 2/3 of the way in. So a lot of potential, a lot of really great ideas. I think all the folklore and everything is super interesting. It's very untapped potential, but it ultimately is a very weak execution.
Yeah, I should mention I watched the Crying Blue Sky cut, which is 22 minutes longer than Eyes of Fire. Avery Krauss, who made this, he originally made it as Crying Blue Sky, and then he did a test screening, which was fairly successful. But while watching it with an audience, he felt that a lot of what he'd shot was not very exciting or didn't really need to be in the movie. So it doesn't even sound like the screening went that badly, but just after it, he felt, I need to trim so much fat out of this. And he made Eyes of Fire out of it, which is a lot shorter. And from what I'm hearing from you guys, pretty difficult to understand. I will say, though, that for me, even though the movie was longer, even though it had those additional minutes in it, I think it's still a fairly difficult movie to piece together. And the characters and plot really aren't that memorable either. I mean, I can remember what everybody looks like, but everybody's relationships and the things that they do, that's difficult to keep hold of. And I do think some of that is that Avery Krauss was primarily a still photographer. I mean, he studied film, and then he did still photography, and then he kind of came back into it with this. This was his first ever feature film, which is pretty ambitious for somebody who's never made a feature film before. And so I think the visuals are really gripping, and I think there's some excellent shots in it. And a lot of the practical effects, a lot of the optical effects were done in camera. And so they look kind of like the effects in something like Bram Stoker's Dracula. They look really interesting. They're not necessarily convincing, but it is a very kind of intriguing, bizarre visual effect that works great in photography, because he uses a lot of that in his photography as well. I like his photos a lot. But here, it does feel a little listless as a movie, I think. And I think the point of this movie, if we're going to compare it to The Witch, which I think is very apt, The Witch works because it's kind of like watching, there's that old saying about, like, if you put a frog in a pot of water and then turn up the heat until it's boiling, and eventually it'll reach a point of, I'm in a boiling pot of water and try and get out. Versus if you drop a frog directly into a pot of boiling water, it'll fight and thrash the whole time. In this film, I think we're meant to kind of get that impression of things are heating up and getting more and more dangerous. And eventually they hit a breaking point where all hell breaks loose and they've got to get out of the valley. But everything is so muted, and it's directed more like a fantasy than a horror film, really, which means you don't really get that sense of kind of impending danger. And all of these characters, so few of them actually die. Something that really works in The Witch is that we start with this family, which is a lot smaller, but we start with this family, and they kind of one by one get kind of like picked off and removed from the family group and made unreliable. And that creates this feeling of loneliness and isolation and fear from the people that I have to rely on are no longer here to help me. And here they're kind of just all sticking around throughout the whole thing, and nature is hostile towards them, but they are never really compromised as a group, which I think is what's so frightening about The Witch. I mean, did you guys find any aspect of this frightening or theoretically frightening even?
No.
No,
I don't think so.
I was going to give a more diplomatic answer that essentially simplifies down to no as well. But I think I don't know. I think the moment when the naked mud people are drinking milk directly from the cow, I instead of being really disturbed or frightened by it or even surprised by it, I was just kind of like, oh, okay. I think that's maybe a sign of how desensitized I am to horror at large, or just how much I've been exposed to at this point. I did like the effects on the tree guys at the end. I have no idea what to call them, but I mean, and there's some cool moments where they show like the actual faces in the trees, and then there are like the mud, and then they like pull the people into the muck. Those were like fun moments that I cited in my review as being like a legend-ish type of effect. Like there's some really great makeup for goblins and other creepy creatures in legend that made me think of. But in terms of being properly scared, I don't know. I think probably the most fearful thing to me would be the stuff at the beginning with the hanging for adultery, or just the like strict Puritanism that can result in the death penalty, I guess, really.
There's plenty of stuff oh, sorry, Mitchell, go ahead.
Zach, it's my period of time to speak. Gosh, every time I talk, it's another regular show episode. That's how long it is. Just think about it like that. All right, now you made me lose my train of thought. Zach. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Okay, well, I was going to say, I think there are definitely moments that are alarming, but either the way they're timed or the way the moment after them is timed, they don't quite sit in the right way in the edit to be frightening. Again, things might be different in The Eyes of Fire cut, because that's apparently moves a bit quicker from what I've heard, but is still fairly slow. I mean, so things like they're tilling a field at one point to plant crops, and Sister, who's an old woman who's with them, smacks down her hoe and cracks open like a skull that's under the dirt, and it splatters blood everywhere. And I think that's a frightening visual or a frightening idea. And she's frightened, but then it immediately cuts to this wide shot of everyone going, "What happened? What is wrong?" There's nothing there. And it just diffuses any tension or fear at all. Another moment would be at some point the mud people, they've killed the cow, and one of them jumps up from behind a bush holding the cow's head in front of its face. That's an alarming visual. And then there's like a 6-minute scene where the preacher and Mr. Jewell talk about, well, what should we do? We should build coffins. They took away the cow. Look at the cow's head. Oh my goodness, the valley is cursed. And it diffuses any tension. They steal one of the girls at one point, and they find her body hanging from a cross upside down by her feet. What a frightening image. And then they have a conversation about it for 6 minutes, and Sister trips over and hits her head on a rock, and it just diffuses any tension. That's happens with a lot of stuff that I think could be frightening in it. Is it just the edit is paced in such a way that frightening things or even alarming things do not have the time to sit with you. They're immediately kind of dismissed and resolved and moved on from, which if I didn't go into this thinking about it as a horror movie, I think might not have been as much of an issue for me. But because, like, if you go into it thinking of it as like a magical realism fantasy thing, that might work. But because it's meant to be a horror film, at least, I don't think it quite works.
A little bit of recency bias here, but it did remind me of the Lord of the Rings animation a lot, the negatives and everything, and I think arguably the adversaries in that are more frightening, especially because there's such a huge number of them. Personally, maybe not the tree. The tree people are up there. If we had a tier list, the tree people would be like a B, you know. But those black things with the red eye, that's an A. That's an A. And we're in, this is fantasy, not actually frightening me tier list.
Sure.
But, another thing I would say, Bone Tomahawk, Christian mentioned, is on Disney Plus. Bone Tomahawk. When you have all of these like speechless, just like maniacal, savage enemies. Usually if they're like rapidly swarming you and attacking you very quickly, then that makes them a lot more frightening. Like that's what makes all the savages in Bone Tomahawk like way more frightening, because they just come out of nowhere and just start throwing shit at you and shooting at you and stuff. And then obviously the ending we talked about a million times, but yes. I just think having like the mud people be such a primary focus at the end and not having really any explanation as to why they're there, other than they're clearly just naked people in mud and they're just chasing after you. And then, like you said, Zach, they don't really kill anybody. So it's, I mean, they take sister away, but like, other than that, they're just not intimidating. I just feel like the tree people, like they were the most intimidating ones. Like they're barely, it's like a creep show. It was, it reminded me a lot of Creep Show, just coming out of the trees. You know, like the Father's Day episode, you know, like that kind of, like it was very well done makeup, and it was just generally very well made characters that were used somewhat sparsely. But just compared to like the rest of the film, I feel like it feeds into what I was talking about with the period being kind of a difficult thing to navigate. And it's kind of one of those things where everyone looks very similar. They're all dressed very similarly, and some of them talk very similarly because they all grew up in the same area, which was convincing, sure, but also confusing as hell when you're trying to keep track of who's who. And thus, when you have all these characters come out that are supposed to be frightening, and all these spirits that come out that, you know, in isolation are actually pretty cool, you know, uses of effects in those moments, like the ghosts out in the field and everything. That was like right at dusk is usually when your eyes can't see stuff very well. So when Leah's having all those visions, like that kind of stuff's really cool. But it just, like you said, I mean, it doesn't amount to anything. And then having all those human discussions and everything afterwards that are just so poorly acted and offer nothing pretty much to the plot at all. It's just, it ruins it. But in isolation, I feel like there are moments that could be a lot more frightening, for sure.
You're mentioning the mud people and the tree people, which in the cut I watched, at least, they refer to, there's a big, like, I don't want to call it a Muppety looking thing, but it kind of has the same silhouette as
it's a
Sweetums from the Muppets. It's this big kind of shaggy witch face thing, which in Crying Blue Sky they refer to it as a witch once. So who knows how many of those there are. I think the implication is there's one, at least in the original cut, and there are some really good effects around those and some creepy visuals. There's a great moment where it kind of like just sinks into like the leaves in the ground and sort of becomes one with the earth. That's a great kind of eerie shot. But I think that's a good point to discuss. Like what did you guys feel was the threat? And by that, I mean, what was your understanding of the logic behind the tree witch or the tree people and the mud people? What was your interpretation of that threat? Because that's a constant criticism for this movie, is that by more than just us, is that threat comes across in a confusing way. So I'm curious as to our basic understanding. What is the antagonist in this movie?
The white man's
Yeah.
culture.
Maybe on a thematic level.
I think that's probably the most straightforward answer you could give. I definitely don't have the correct answer, Zach, because I didn't know. I couldn't tell you. And we haven't even mentioned yet this whole threat of the Indians in the area or whatever that they're also frightened of, and I guess there's that one fleeting attack, but I was confused about Leah's allegiance and the significance of her visions, which seemed like they were presented as though they were fated to occur during the film, and then I think at least some of them did not. And I don't know, going back to what Mitchell said, I think there's this sort of overarching idea similarly to The Witch where I don't know, extreme orthodoxy or puritanism is really what sends you in the opposite direction at the end of the day. An absence of moderation, I guess. But it all links back to having trouble with following the characters. I think the plot is just unavoidably related to that. And I want to try to piece together more how these two cuts are different, because at least my perception of the shorter cut was that director man, what's his face, Avery Crounce, was wanted to get out of the settlement as quickly as possible. So I felt like the whole gang was out of there before I knew who any of the gang was, except maybe Preacher Man Will. So yeah, and I think without that exposition, I was sort of spending the rest of the movie playing catch up, and I mean, it's hard to talk about any of these things in isolation, I guess.
Yeah, they're kicked out of the village pretty quick in Crying Blue Sky as well. But I think maybe a potential difference is that Crying Blue Sky, there is constant voiceover throughout the entirety of the film from, I think, from the one older daughter who is, we haven't even mentioned the mountain man. There's a fur trapper named Marion who is the actual husband of the preacher's lover,
who is based,
and his daughter, his adult daughter or older teenage daughter, also follows them into the woods. So that daughter and the two little girls at the end of the movie escape, and depending upon the cut that you watch, they end up either at a French settlement or at a mission where they talk to, it doesn't really matter because the wraparound I think is the same. They talk to some guy about what happened. But it's difficult because the two little girls' voices are quite similar. It's difficult to tell what they're saying apart throughout. And then the older daughter is also giving narration, but because there's so many blonde women in bonnets throughout the movie, it's difficult to keep track of where everybody is at certain points and what they've seen and what they've heard. So what perspective is the voiceover coming from? So in a lot of ways, it doesn't help to explain that much, even though it's very present and constantly telling you, we were kicked out of the village because of this, and then we cut off the ferry and went down the river, and da-da-da-da-da. Especially once they get into the valley, and it's just kind of a war of attrition with nature. The constant updates, in a way, feel like they're distancing you more from the actual plot.
I definitely feel the same way when they had the narration in our cut. It was sparse enough where it didn't completely bother me. There wasn't that much overhead, but when it came up, I was like, I just don't want to hear you talk right now. You're not giving me any information that I can already see right now. In fact, half the time, at least, they're just saying what I was witnessing. And I understand, okay, the wraparound is the point. We're being told this story, but it's just, it's supposed to, I assume it's supposed to enable the fact that it's a folk tale and that it's like, oh, this spooky thing happened and we're telling you about it. And it's funny how it's ironic that the French people just don't care and they are completely not convinced. And then they have a thriller. We'll probably mention the ending, but the thriller moment at the end, like, oh, it's the eyes and Leah's there. And we don't really understand why, but
okay.
Yeah.
Talk me through that then. Because I don't think that happens in Crying Blue Sky. So
really?
this is interesting. That might be the only change in the ending, is that Avery Krauss wanted like a shock ending.
So the French people are like, yeah, we don't believe you. That sounds made up. And then the girl's looking at this flower, and then she's hearing voices, and then or something, and then the main French guy is telling the other French guy, hey, take them away. And then he's like, all right, and he's walking over, and then it literally is like Thriller when the yellow eyes come out, and then it plays a tune, and that's how it ends.
It's so abrupt. It literally it's like a filter places itself over this dude that's walking over, and it's like a 1 second thing, and then it's like credits, quick.
Oh jeez.
Yeah.
See, in Crying Blue Sky, the wraparound is pretty much exactly the same in the purpose that it serves. At the beginning, we don't know where they are. They kind of seem to be in a white void when they're talking like to the camera, or really they're kind of talking like up to the corner as if like they're speaking to God or praying or something. So what is the context of this narration? Is this set decades later? Are they dead? They're ghosts telling the story. And then at the end, it's revealed that they're in like they're in a mission. They're talking to a priest in front of a fireplace. And there is no scare ending. They kind of look into the fireplace, and then they fade to a shot of like the misty valley and credits roll. It's a much more placid ending, I guess, which is probably truer to the original vision of what the movie was going to be. But
sounds lame.
Isn't as much of a horror ending, I guess. But it doesn't sound like Eyes of Fire has a great horror ending either.
Yeah, it's pretty lame too.
Yeah, I think maybe the idea of what the threat is comes across a lot clearer in Crying Blue Sky then, because there's a great deal of focus in Crying Blue Sky put upon the idea of there's this Native American belief that the devil is not like a spiritual thing that watches from afar and influences you to do evil things from hell or wherever. The devil is a physical creature that exists in the dark places of the earth that we can't understand. So the darkness of the forest, that's where the devil dwells. And don't walk too deep into the forest alone, or he might get you. And this very literal idea of that from the Native American perspective. Now, if there's any truth to that, I don't know, but it's interesting, at least as presented here. And they also mention this idea that the servants of the devil are the results of the evil that men do. So when things are killed, when people are killed, the blood from that death seeps into the ground and collects somewhere and forms like an evil being that can take further people under its spell and take them under control. And I think the implication then is that the tree witch is the result of this violence and the evil of man and the blood pooling in a given location, which I guess would be the tree that it lives in at night. And I think the mud people are meant to be the French people who lived in the valley before them and made the cabins, because there's a scene where Leah sees like a bunch of French people standing in the valley at night going, I mean, they're speaking French, but they're essentially going, "Oh, sacre bleu, we are dead," and they vanish as quickly as they appeared. And I, in terms of Leah, that's pretty roughly explained too. But I think the idea is that she's, in the parlance of 1750, she would probably be referred to as a simpleton, and that innocence allows her to connect to the good side of like the unknown and the forest, and so she becomes like one with the woods and becomes a white witch at the end, which allows her to combat The tree witch, I think.
Huh?
My voice is getting higher as I explain this. That was my reading on the ending, though. So I do think there's some sense made, if not a great amount.
This sounds like that one meme where it's like you're 3 words into a line of poetry, and the English teacher's like, all right, let's stop and analyze this for a second. Let's analyze this. Because none of that came across to me, Zach. It makes sense that you're explaining it to me right now.
No.
Fantastic. Great job. But I did not get that when I was watching it. It's so hard to even, without like telling the viewer that over a campfire. Like if you were Mary and Zach explaining this over the campfire, I feel like that would be a lot more helpful. But then it just sounds like expository dumping. And it just feels like there's no way that you can integrate that in effectively when you have all this other crap going on. And it's like, what else is there that you can cut out at that point? Like, I don't know. It's just very confusing. It's a very, very lumpy story. I have an ace up my sleeve. Are you ready? Comparison. Sure. 3, 2, 1. Blair Witch Project. Okay. Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
Very uncomplicated. Nobody knows anything about anything. They just know about this witch in the woods that's doing stuff. And nobody knows anything about the witch. Nobody knows. They've heard stories, or they know people that stuff has happened to them.
Yeah.
And it's just normal, average people that have heard about it. They all have different philosophies on it. And the teenager's like, whatever, we're going to go and try to film it. Like, they don't really regard any of it. And they all 3 of them have different perspectives on it, and they have different opinions and beliefs based off of it. And all that goes haywire when they're getting attacked by something that's literally never shown the entire film. And I just think a lot of that unknown, a lot of that just basing it off of this one or these 2 cameras and just being a lot more simple about it would probably have been a lot more effective. And I feel like The Witch does that a lot better as well. That there's a lot less that's really explained, and a lot of it is left more to kind of the thematic undertones, like things that you can very easily pick up on that don't really need to be explained. But if there's all of this lore, I'm not saying there shouldn't be any of this lore, or that there shouldn't be this whole world, and there shouldn't be like this nature relationship and like the integration of different beliefs of the devil and stuff. But it's just all like hinted at. It's never really brought out into fruition. So if you're going to have all of this background story, you might as well have a way to actually present it, rather than having like, well, look, this could be a little kernel of something, and then it turns out into nothing, which is like the entire film for me.
You bring up a good point with Blair Witch, where I think they could have done that. And I think Blair Witch works because you are told in a literal fashion so little about the actual Blair Witch and the mythology of the Blair Witch or whatever, but you pick it up through what you're given and what you're presented with. And it's not that difficult to figure out. And if there is stuff you don't pick up, it doesn't really matter, because it's still spooky and it still adds to the confusion of the characters. They could have done that here. I think the attempt to explain the mystical, magical reasoning behind things just makes it so much more complicated. Like the ending when Marion defeats the tree witch by like he's part of the tree and he pulls her out of the tree with him. Yeah. And in the movie, that's filled with this constant narration and a cut to an extreme close-up of Leah like gurning into the camera, like trying to like kind of shout this explanation of what he's doing, and then he rips a gecko out of the witch's mouth and she eats it. And
it was like, a gecko.
The additional like explanation and the additional like detail just makes it so much more confusing and hard to follow. I feel like if we saw him like straining and then pull her out of the tree, okay, we got it. Like he was under her spell and he fought it and defeated her. There you go. We didn't need all this like additional like attempts to explain the magical bumpkins and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the biggest problem with the bookends and the voiceover, is that they don't actually enable one's understanding of the story or improve it at all. The only specific bit I remember of the voiceover is Fanny talking about how horned up her mother is, for lack of a better term, and how she's become the mother or whatever. And I was just like, that's kind of weird. And in the first bookend, at least, I don't think I put together that was not sequential until it then popped up again at the end of the film, which just, I think, increased the confusion at the outset. Yeah, the more we talk about this, I think I'm going to have to move this down to a 2 and not a 2.5. Sorry, Zach.
Yeah, that is fair. I would say my final thing I'm going to challenge from you guys, because we talked about this movie for a while at this point, is I'm intrigued to hear something good you have to say about the movie. I'm going to give you the say something nice challenge. I would say, despite having a lot of flaws, and like we've talked about, maybe not being that frightening, I do really enjoy the atmosphere of this movie. I think this has a great kind of natural folk horror fall feeling about it. That does make this a really good October watch. I would not advise that you watch this on Halloween. This isn't a great capper to your Halloween marathon. And I know some people, they watch a horror movie every day in October, and they make a letterbox list about it, and I don't know who I could possibly be talking about. I'm not personally of that persuasion, because for me, I have tried that in the past, but that kind of turns like the season into a chore for me. I'm kind of the watch one solid pick per week leading up to Halloween. And I think this is a good week 1 of October pick, because it's not the best film in the world, but it is imaginative. It does set that fall feeling, and it kind of sets up the season for things to get eerier and spookier as you continue with the Halloween marathon. So that's my plus. Even though, if you want to be frightened, The Witch is a much scarier and probably better movie, I would still recommend this as kind of a unique scary story vibe.
Yeah, I think probably one of my favorite parts of it, not obviously the atmosphere would be my favorite part, but my second favorite part would be the dynamic with Will not being straightforward and not being a clear evangelist, like a cookie cutter evangelist, because I really don't feel like he was. Honestly, I do feel like he was genuinely his own character, and he wasn't profound or charismatic or convincing. He was very much the opposite of what you would want in a religious leader. And yes. I feel like and he doesn't really misuse scripture to a full extent or anything. I just feel like he's narrow-minded, misinformed, etc. A normal, he kind of feels like a more average, what you would expect of an evangelist of the time, just with a lot less personality and a lot less interpersonal tact. And I feel like having that contrast with all of the discussions with Marion and Marion's essentially we're part of nature, we're not over nature or anything, and that we're he feels like he's living off the land. He's more representative of kind of a Shawnee perspective than he would be of the average Puritan or something at the time. And I just feel like that's a really cool dynamic. And no, it doesn't make you feel any more sympathetic for the little girl lunging at the other little girls to attack them. But I do think that was a very cool thing. And then him getting his comeuppance and everything was a little bit satisfying too, I feel like.
Yeah. His downfall is well executed, I think, when he gives her those flowers and it's clear that all right, we're past the point of no return here, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that ambiguity there is interesting. I wish I could have devoted more attention to it. I've already mentioned that I liked the just the makeup and the visual realization of the tree, the spooky guys at the end. But I guess another thing I liked would be the performance, the actress behind Leah, Carlene Crockett is her name. She doesn't have a ton of film credits to her name, which is always interesting when we watch an older film and it seems like the actor didn't do a lot didn't really stay in the business. But I think it's always a challenge to sort of deliver a nuanced performance without any lines. And if nothing else, I think that she probably contributes to the tone of the film the most of the characters. I think, intentional or not, I felt like there was an ambiguity about her allegiance and her goodness, being that she saves Will at the beginning and then is having these kind of nasty premonitions at the end, and is alternatively rescuing or not rescuing people. But yeah, I thought that was effectively. I think you need at least one performance to suit the atmosphere. It can't all just be lighting and this other exterior stuff. And I think she probably gets the closest to doing that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Final thought before
and
you
don't
move on to
forget
weekend
about
review.
Rob Paulson.
Oh yes, we can bring that up if you want, Mitchell, because that's something that's mentioned in I bought the Blu-ray of this, and during the interview, that's something with the director. That's something which is kind of hilarious to watch. Avery Krauss as like a 50-year-old is this very like folksy Kentucky man. They did the interview over Zoom, clearly, because the Blu-ray for this was prepped during the pandemic, and he spends most of it like leaning back in his living room chair eating corn nuts out of his hand. But the interviewer mentions like, oh, and Rob Paulson went on to do a lot of voice acting, and Avery Krauss kind of goes, good for him. That's his only comment on the issue. But yeah, he was in what, Mitchell?
He was Carl Weezer and Wacko's World. He was also Danny Phantom's dad and Christian the Who's It What in Lilo and Stitch.
Oh, I don't even know his name, but I jumped on his Letterboxd profile and it's just full of Disney sequels, which is really funny.
And Box Ghost. I love him. He's a great actor.
And I think he's a consistent,
not a great actor.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles voice actor as well.
Yeah,
I think he keeps getting invited back for those. Yeah. So maybe the most successful member of this cast, actually, who plays Jewel, I think is his role. I was just going to say before we move on to Weekend Review, I don't know if this movie ever got a novelization, but I think it's the rare case of a movie that might actually work better as a novelization than a movie. Because I can picture this being, the way it's put together feels a lot like I think it's an epistolary novel, where it's pieced together from like journal entries and letters and things like that. I can see, like, in novel form, there's a framing device. Oh, we French trappers came upon these cabins and we found these pages all over and we put them together and this seems to be what happened. And it's all the different, you could work the voiceover in, and it's all these different accounts of how their settlement fell apart. That feels like it would almost be a better format for this narrative than the movie. But we're leaving Eyes of Fire / Crying Blue Sky behind, and we are moving on to Week in Review, which I think is an actual week in review. It's only been like a week and a half since we recorded our finale for the last season, but you'll never know that, or you wouldn't have unless I said so. What have you guys been watching over the past week?
Ooh, I don't want to go first because I don't know what I want to
talk
about.
I'll go first.
Okay.
You got to remind me, did I talk about Alien Romulus last time?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Huh.
Mm.
Are you sure? Oh, I talked about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes.
Yes, you did talk about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't remember if I talked about it or not, but I believe you. Alien Romulus. Alien Romulus. Zach will never see it. Ever. He'll
Probably
never
not.
see it. It's terrible. The disrespect to Grand Moff Tarkin started something awful. That's
true.
what happened. That's
He made the Death
part.
Star.
That's true. And as I have this breath mint in my mouth, I'm thinking about how epic Alien and Aliens were, and that there's two concepts that were epic in both of them, right? The first Alien is condensed. It's like an 80s slasher movie in space, right? And Aliens is like an action-y version of that, where you have this ragtag group, Dirty Dozen, and there's a million aliens, and they're all over the place, and it's really cool to see an action format, right? So what if we treat both of those films as canon, and we treat them as like that, like this is the launch point now. We're just gonna pretend that Covenant and Prometheus just nope, right? We're just gonna go back old school. And it's a great perspective. It's really great. I think it's really great because the execution here is awesome in terms of the production. It's very obviously nostalgic, right? There's a lot of people claiming that this is nostalgia bait. I don't feel like it really gets into baity territory, except with what I just mentioned. But with everything else, like the acting is super convincing. It's very fresh feeling. It doesn't feel like Nostromo at all. It feels like its own station. Definitely inspired by Alien Isolation. I am expert brain on that game, and definitely a lot of game inspired moments in it as well. It just feels like a very comprehensive love letter type of film, and there are some things in it that are questionable in terms of, like, you know, you get the oh come on moments, like how is she still alive, those kinds of things. The android philosophy is always changing. Like there's always the main android in every single one, and like what is their, are they good, are they bad? The android here is fantastic. He's an awesome actor. I forgot his name because it's been a while since this is month in review for me right now.
David Johnson
is fantastic. Thank you. He's very multifaceted. He's probably the most multifaceted android, I think, out of all of the ones that I've seen. And I just really enjoyed it. It was very fun. It was very hard to tell when the alien was actually going to kill and when it wasn't. And then obviously there's more than one that show up later. And I just think, I don't know. I really, there's really a lot to enjoy. There's a lot to pick up on. If you really enjoyed any aspect of the Alien universe, that I feel like there's isolated moments that are specifically for you in this. And it gets very actiony. There's a lot of very actiony moments, especially towards the end. And I mean, yeah, it's kind of playing off the ending of the first one a little bit too much, but there's an awesome humanoid enemy that's just amazing work in terms of the effects there. It's an actual person too. He's like almost 7 feet tall, I think, in real life. Just it was very thrilling. I was very surprised at how good it was. Now, obviously, like I said, there's some nostalgia parts that are like, okay, this is pretty cut and paste right now. A little bit baity, a little bit like this is the only way we could have done this. Feels like it's a little bit going further than paying homage, but yeah, I definitely recommend it. Especially if people were expecting something different out of Prometheus when it first came out. I feel like that's a good target audience also. I feel like this is it's a fun time. It's a fun time. That's what I'll say.
I actually quite like Prometheus, but
I like
that's
Prometheus
a discussion
too.
For another episode.
But you gave Prometheus a 2, Zach.
I can like something without thinking it's very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
The main thing with Prometheus,
one of my favorite directors is Dario Argento. Please.
The doctors are stupid. How are the doctors so stupid? That's the big true. Prometheus question.
Yeah, they make a lot of dumb horror movie choices, but like conceptually, I did not mind what Prometheus was going for, which a lot of people seem to hate it for that reason. Where's the alien?
I should also mention the face huggers get their due diligence here. This is fantastic face hugger footage. 100%. And the face huggers, like, you know, it's like they're always the first thing that's introduced, and it just sets the tone. Like, this is how weird this can get. Like when you have things sucking on somebody's face, like that alone is that enough. That's very stressful.
Oh my god. Oh, it's terrible. Ugh, I don't even want to think about it. I guess my reaction is proof that Mitchell's right. I got to give my 2 cents about Romulus. I didn't want to see it. I went because my parents wanted to see it. I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. Landed on a 3. David Johnson's amazing. Kaylee Spaney is very good. She's incredible in Priscilla, and it seems like she's kind of getting more parts. She was in Civil War and some other things recently. I think the beginning of Romulus, the sort of world building and the sort of grungy industrial planet vibe and all that was really great. And I think the big swing at the end is actually kind of interesting. Part of me wants to force Zach to watch this at some point, but
Yeah,
maybe we'll see.
I'd really want to hear what Zach says. There's really a lot to pick apart. I also say one of the weakest parts is the other side characters kind of mid. But
yeah, I agree. Well, I guess it's time for me to pick what I'm talking about, even though I still don't want to pick. I guess I'll stick with spooky season, especially since Mitchell just did that with Romulus. I've watched 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not counting Eyes of Fire, 6 horror movies or horror adjacent movies this month of October. I guess I'll talk about Perfect Blue, which is kind of an offbeat pick for me. My first, I'm pretty sure this is my first like quote unquote anime movie. This is very much a world that I'm not well acquainted with.
No Studio Ghibli stuff?
I've seen a couple Ghiblis and I did not like them at the time. I think I Howl's Moving Castle was fine, but kind of convoluted. I mean, this was years ago. I've not seen Ghibli in a long time. But and my whole family saw Ponyo in theaters, and I remember all 4 of us getting out of the theater and like, what the heck was that? That was so weird, and I didn't get it at all. And that was like, it's a fond memory because all of us were just like, what the heck? What? But I could see myself taking it differently now. But Perfect Blue is Roger Corman described it as the film that Hitchcock and Walt Disney would make if they made one together, which is, I think, an interesting and pretty effective tagline for it. It centers around this pop star, this girl who's in like a 3-person pop group, and then she leaves the group to become an actor, and then she's asked to do like some really unsavory stuff in this TV show that she's cast in, and then there's like a stalker thing, and I don't want to give too much away, but there are a few clever twists and turns, and on the whole, I would say it was very effective. I landed on a 4.5. I think it could have been a 4. It could have been less. I think there are some issues here where the sort of like condemnation of the male gaze or like sexual commodification of women, I guess the way that this film achieves that is in part also a portrayal of those things to some extent, which is sort of unavoidable to some extent. It's kind of a similar complaint to one that I have with, of all things, Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street, where I feel like, Marty's very famously like, you don't need me to tell you Jordan Belfort is bad. Obviously he's bad. And I'm like, okay, sure, I accept that. But Belfort was like at least marginally involved with the film. The film is based on or inspired by his memoir. He like talked to Leo DiCaprio about his performance. And I think the film has actually greatly benefited Belfort in the long run in terms of his like brand and net worth and all these things. So it's just, I think this is another case of like the morality of film being a tricky thing, and the ease with which I rated it so much higher than I rated The Wolf of Wall Street is making me introspect a little bit. But it is an effective horror movie. The ending is like a little bit disappointing. It's hard to talk about this without spoiling it, but and I did have to adjust to the animation being a little less detailed than something like a prestige Disney, like a Pinocchio. There's just it's a much more economical in terms of how kinetic things are. There are a lot of still backgrounds and characters move kind of in a more blocky way. It's just not as fluid, and that's kind of the style. But the movie here is so good that doesn't really hold it back much. So 4.5. I don't think I'm going to seek out a ton of anime films, but I'm glad I watched this one.
A lot of anime are also, they're based around a theatrical 5-act structure rather than the more typical cinematic 3 acts, which can make them weird to watch. There's a lot of Studio Ghibli movies, especially early ones, where you hit a point halfway through where you're like, oh, this is the climax. The movie is ending. And then it goes on for another hour because you still got those other 2 acts. I did not watch an animated film so far this month. I'm going to stick to spooky as well. I think when we did our first Halloween special, we talked about The Exorcist. And during the weekend review for that episode, I talked about Dark Shadows, which is a show I had just started watching. I was maybe 20 episodes in. Now, for our listeners who haven't watched that episode or maybe don't remember, Dark Shadows was a long-running gothic horror soap opera that went out on, I think, ABC in the 60s and early 70s. It was only 5 seasons long, but because it was a soap opera, it went out basically every single day of the year. So with only 5 seasons, the show is 1,225 episodes long. I have just reached episode 246, I think.
Oh my God.
Because I've taken long breaks between viewings, because as with a lot of soap operas, it's difficult to get into watching them because they are slow. The first 20 episodes of Dark Shadows, I think 20, maybe 10, 15, all take place within the same night. Like, the beginning of the show is our main character arrives in town, and the first 10 episodes are, I'm getting off the train. Where is my luggage? I need to go to the bar. I met this person at the bar. Where do I work? I have to go to the place that I work. They won't let me into the place that I work. Maybe I could talk to the groundskeeper. And everything is covered because since there were so many episodes, the writers just couldn't. You can't write plot for like 365 episodes in a single year. Like, no writer is capable of writing meaty half-hour plots for that long running of a show. It's not something you can do, and it's also not something you can budget. So it is a very slow show, but a lot of people recommend that you start at the point that I just got to, which is episode 210. So I'm about like 20, 30 episodes from the point where most people tell you to start, which is when Barnabas Collins shows up, who is a long dead vampire that is an ancestor of the Collins family who live in Collinsport, Maine, in the Collins estate. And you have to remember, before this is primarily a gothic drama about a family trying to maintain ownership of their fishing company and cannery, and then a vampire shows up. And it's pretty wild, but as soon as he shows up, it gets so much better. I've watched these like 30 episodes after Barnabas shows up over the past like 2 weeks or something. Dark Shadows has gone from a show that I would watch as a chore between other shows, hoping that I would reach something interesting at some point, to a show that I'm actively enjoying and having fun with. And it was shot very quickly. It's very cheap. There's points where you can see obvious bloopers that they just had to keep in the show because they had to keep shooting it. There's a point where you can hear like an assistant director off camera that like the scene is going, and they shot soap operas basically live. There's one point where the camera starts moving and you can hear an assistant director go, "No, wait," and then realize they're saying something while the cameras are rolling, and they hurriedly cut to a different camera and then come back to that one later. I don't know if someone was about to trip over a cable or something, but it's very rough. It's very cheap, but the performances and the effects do have a real charm about them. And every now and then, despite it being so ropey, there is a moment, there is a little something that is genuinely kind of creepy. There's an episode, now that the vampire showed up, it's basically a Dracula remake in the modern 1960s. And there's an episode where one of our female leads has a dream where she opens a coffin and she's inside it, and we cut back to her and she's a screaming skeleton, and it's kind of silly, but it's also fairly creepy within the cheap confines of the show. I don't think it's something I would recommend to anyone, much like a lot of the stuff I watched. But it's definitely an intriguing watch. If listening to this, you think that sounds like fun, I would highly recommend that you do not start at the beginning like I did. I'd recommend you start at episode 210, like everybody says you should.
Oh my God.
Okay.
It's an episode that was designed to be watched by people like who missed a bunch of episodes. It's just something on TV because it was made in the 60s and that's what TV it was at that point. So you won't have any trouble catching up. And that's where it starts to get genuinely fun. If you enjoy that, maybe go back and try to watch it from the beginning and see what you think of it. But if you don't like 210 on, you're not going to find some gold nugget that you love in the first 210 episodes. Like, that's where the show gets interesting. If that's not your jam, I don't blame you, but Dark Shadows might not be for you. So that's my 4-year update on Dark Shadows. Join me in another 4 years when I will have reached the halfway point of the whole show.
I think the sort of guerrilla aspect of that assistant director saying, no, wait, I think it would be really fun to make a short or a movie that sort of incorporates that scrappiness consciously into, maybe it's not too far removed from whatever the frickin' Saturday Night Movie is. I don't know if it's getting well reviewed or not, but I would like to see you in particular, Zach, mess with that conceit in some way.
There is a great movie, a great horror movie that does exactly that, but I don't want to say what it is because it's a twist in the movie. And so that would kind of give away the game, but maybe I'll bring that to a future Halloween special because that could be a fun watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy.
If we did merch, we would need a shirt with Zach's quote, start at episode 210 like everyone says you should. That's just so good.
It's one of Zach's various pointing poses. We could use one of those.
Oh yeah, I have enough to run for office on those pointing poses at this point. Is it time for the Halloween rundown? Should I get to running through the 100-acre wood? No, Sleepy Hollow. That's what I'm thinking of.
The 100-acre wood. Me and Christian are bringing the cow with us. We're taking our clothes off. And
oh my god!
Running after you.
Oh my giddy aunt.
Build coffins.
Yeah, let's see. Mitchell's starting.
Okay.
It's undoubtedly.
I'm glad we made that decision.
in 3, 2, 1, go.
Golden Frog Power.
3 out of 5.
Talk of Witches.
4 out of 5.
Explaining the lore to random French dudes.
2 out of 5.
Eating dirt.
2 out of 5.
Breaking the noose after he falls.
3 out of 5.
Being inside a cabin with more than one woman.
3 out of 5.
Going to sleep.
2 out of 5.
Eating the squirrel.
3 out of 5.
Ray in a brandy keg.
4 out of 5.
Pernickety Indians.
2 out of 5.
Shawnee mind tricks.
3 out of 5.
Premonitions.
4 out of 5.
Leia ambush.
3 out of 5.
Spooky Mudface.
4 out of 5.
Leprechauns.
3 out of 5.
Stealing a man's box of books.
2 out of 5.
Eating the rabbit.
2 out of 5.
An Irish Fairy.
3 out of 5.
Child acting.
2 out of 5.
Red Highlight Attack.
3 out of 5.
1
Fire.
4 out of 5.
That's a good one to end on.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next two were of and eyes. Not really.
Well, that brings us to the end of this year's Halloween special.
Mm-hmm.
Listeners, we hope you've had a good spooky season. This will probably come out later this month, but so you're probably gearing up for Halloween right now. I hope you enjoy the night. Happy Halloween. And we will see you probably for the winter holidays very shortly later this year, where we're brewing up what those specials are going to look like. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, happy Halloween and good night.
See you in the flippity flop.
Ooh.